There's a photograph of Mrs. Moore on the left side of the door, the front door, when you go into the building. And it's an actual photograph of her. But the story of the photograph is, on the left side of the door, as you go in, they have this portrait of her hung, because it's her building. It's Mrs. Moore's. It's Elizabeth Moore Hall. And I think it was in the mid to late 70s, the people wanted to change the portrait of Mrs. Moore with someone who was, working in the building at the time, and who was alive, just to give them an extra level of distinction. And so they took Mrs. Moore's portrait off the wall and they put it somewhere else, just, around the wall somewhere else, and they put that fellow next to the door. And came in the next morning, and Mrs. Moore was back on the nail on the wall where she had been before for years, and the fellow's portrait was on the floor, like leaning up against the wall, And, it kept happening a few times, and they thought at first it was just a prank, by someone who worked there or someone who was kind of disgruntled that they were changing the portraits out or whatever. And when it kept happening, then the rumors started that it was Mrs. Moore, it was Elizabeth, and she was mad that they were moving her picture. And so to squelch the rumors a little bit, they decided they were going to close the building. They were going to put Mrs. Moore in a closet and lock it. And they were going to take the fellow's portrait and hang it up on the wall where they wanted it, right by the door. And when they came in the next morning, even though you could not go into the building, it was locked, everyone was gone, you could not go into the building all night long. When they came in the next morning, Mrs. Moore's portrait was back up on the wall. The closet that they'd stuck her in, the door was wide open, and the fellow was back on the floor leaning up against the wall like he had always been every time they had changed the picture. And ever since then, they have not tried to change that photograph. Another hero of mine, she came here from Wheeling. She came to Morgantown from Wheeling. She had been a school teacher from the age of 14 or 15. She and her husband moved to Morgantown, and they started the Morgantown Academy for Men and the Woodburn Seminary for Women. Then Mrs. Moore, of course, ran the women's school, and Mr. Moore ran the men's. And then, unfortunately, Mr. Moore passed away from an illness. We don't know exactly what, but he passed away, but she kept going on as the headmistress of Woodburn Academy. And during her tenure, the Civil War broke out in West Virginia. And the women that were at her academy were actually the daughters of Piedmont families who were very, very wealthy. Because back in that day, if you were getting a good education, you had to be wealthy. There was no public education system. So when the war broke out, the Confederacy raided West Virginia, trying to keep it from becoming a state. And they were trying to capture Waitman T. Willie, who was our senator at the time, who actually wrote up the documents to make the state of West Virginia, or a great many of them. And he lived in Morgantown, so they came to Morgantown. The Confederate Army raided Morgantown, right up South High Street into the middle of Morgantown, and they went on up to Woodburn Academy, or the Woodburn Seminary for Women. And they had been, raiding things as going along, stealing horses and such. When they got to the academy, Mrs. Moore had the forethought to hide the students that were there in the basement of the building. And she and Mrs. Green, who was the African-American working there, she was the cook, they served the Confederate Army tea to keep them from burning the building to the ground. It was more of a, we have to do something and we can't fight them off move. We're in grave danger. After the Confederate Army, left, they came up out of the basement and they were much safer. Then in I think it was 1899, W.Va admitted its first female student. Mrs. Moore, was was a champion of that cause, of course, because she was a champion of education for everyone, not just men. And she wanted there to be a space for just the women to have their own space. So they built E. Moore Hall, which is Elizabeth Moore Hall. It was named after Elizabeth Moore. And there was a toss to see, or a sort of a discussion to see who the building would be named after. Would it be Lena Yost, or if it would be Mrs. Moore? And in the end of it, Lena said, no, Elizabeth deserves it more than I do, or I like Elizabeth too, so let's just name it after Elizabeth. Like, Lena basically said, no, I don't want to have that distinction. Give it to Elizabeth, so they did. And so it became Elizabeth Moore Hall. And it was finished and built about the same time, unfortunately, that, or it was built, and Mrs. Moore knew it was being built, and she was helping with every part of it. And then, unfortunately, it finished about the same time that she passed away. However, Elizabeth still is in the building. Allegedly, people have seen her multiple times walking through the building. In the past, she has walked along the balconies. She has walked up the staircase and vanished down to her feet as she's done so. She starts as a full figure and just shrinks down. And then back before anything was programmable, she would make coffee in the morning for some of the people that worked there. There would be times where she would light up all the phones and then appear like she would just walk through the room. It's a very interesting thing. The interesting thing about the stories, though, are that she will only appear to women. She will appear to men if they are in a company of a woman. So when there was an occasion where there's a swimming pool in the basement of the building, and there was an occasion where a man and a woman student were swimming in the pool together, and they looked up and Mrs. Moore was floating over the water next to them. And when you put this in the context of Mrs. Moore's time, a young girl or young lady would not be on a date with a young man without a chaperone. They could have just been, they could have stayed, swum around the pool if they wanted to, but Mrs. Moore was not going to leave because she was the chaperone. If you put the stories in that context of the time, it helps to understand a lot of things. Plus, it just makes it more interesting. It makes it more fun. Basically, the first time I'd ever heard of Sally was I was collecting the ghost stories around 2006, and one of the custodians, one of the facilities maintenance people at the university, came to me on his break, and I was working in the front area of an office, and he says, I hear you're collecting ghost stories, and he said, I wonder if you've heard anything about this little girl that haunts the hallway back here. And I said, no. And he proceeds to tell me about how he's mopping the floor in the hallway, and he sees this little girl just come out of the one doorway and dance around in the middle of the hallway, and she's wearing a yellow dress. She's got a big yellow bow in the back of her hair. She's got long ringlets, long blonde ringlets of hair. And he said she just dancing around in circles, and then she said she went around the corner. And he said, I was waiting for her to come back because I'm mopping the floor. And and he said, I wanted to make sure that she wasn't going to fall. And he said she never came back around the corner. And he looked around the corner, she wasn't there. And there's no way she could have gone out, without him hearing her leaving. And he looked around the offices thinking it was someone's child, someone had their kid there for after hours. No, that wasn't the case. And it was very weird for him to ask, describe this figure that he saw. And as he's telling me this story, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I've got to find out who this little girl is, And so he comes back 2 days later, and he tells me something similar, and he's got a friend with him. And his friend's telling us, he's like, yeah, we were over in Stewart Hall, and we saw this little girl dancing around on the second floor of Stewart Hall around the columns. And she was wearing a yellow dress, long yellow ringlets, big yellow bow in the back of her hair. And she went around one of the columns and she just disappeared. And I said, oh my gosh, now I really have to find out who this girl is. I really have to find out who this girl is. And so we did a little research. A friend of mine helped me with this, and we went down to the courthouse and we found out that there was actually a cemetery in the spot where Stewart Hall is now. And they had removed the cemetery and taken the bodies to the larger cemetery in town. And they had a list of all the people that had been interred in the cemetery, and how old they were. And on the list was a girl named Sally, who was about 8 years old, and that was the only child other than like an infant, and we're like, oh my gosh, that might be her. And then, we started looking around. We're like, the Mountainlair is not old enough to have a ghost from that time period, because it was like 1905, 1910, 1920, 25, something like, and it's like, where did she come from? Well, then we did more research. The Mountainlair actually replaced a building called Reynolds Hall, which was the original commencement building, graduation, event building, field house, all kinds of things for the campus. Basically everywhere, every event they had it in that building. And so the theory of the story is that Sally attended a party in Reynolds Hall when she was a child, probably with her parents, at some university event. She had fun dancing, and we also found that during the time that she died, there was a typhoid epidemic that went through Morgantown that killed a lot of people, young and old particularly. And we think that probably what happened is she was at a party in Reynolds Hall, having had a lot of fun, and then shortly thereafter she passed away and was buried in the cemetery where Stewart Hall is now. And that's why her ghost goes between the Mountainlair and Stewart Hall, but always on the second floor for some reason. My experience with Sally is my office was actually, it had been several places in the Mountainlair over the years. The one that you're interested in is on the second floor in that very hallway. And I mean, I know a lot of people are going to think, well, he knew the story, so he's just freaking himself out about it. No, I was literally not even, I didn't even realize that was the hallway at first when I moved in there. And then over time, I was like, oh my gosh, this is her hallway. So I really didn't understand the importance of the location I was at. But when my scissors came up missing, I was looking for they were titanium, they were my favorite. They had silver handles, or not silver, yellow handles, scissors, and I'm looking for them and I can't find them. And I had literally been cutting things out, and my desk was strewn with paper, and my scissors, I'd put them down right there. I turned around to look at my computer screen over here, looked back again, the scissors were gone. My work study was in the room with me, and I asked him if he had taken the scissors. I said, did you borrow my scissors? He's like, no, I didn't, which, he was working on his laptop at the time, so obviously no. I said, well, help me look for them. So we looked through all the paper that was there. There wasn't much, but, looked around, looked under the desk, looked under the chair in case they fell off, under the other desk in the room. Nothing. We went down the hallway, asked every office. There was only one person in another office, and asked them if they had my scissors, and she said, no, I didn't come down and borrow your scissors, which I knew was an impossibility because it was literally 2 seconds. But I thought, I'm just going to, waste time and find out where these scissors went to in case anyone did take them. And he came over from another office and said, they don't have the scissors. And I said, well, I don't have the scissors. And we went back in the office, they were on the desk.